Okay. So this is day two of a public journal of sorts to figure out what the hell I am doing now that I left a pretty stable job last week. Um, had a stream yesterday where I was just talking to a good friend of mine, known each other for a very long time, and he was determined to ask me some really hard questions, just about like, okay, why are you doing this? Um, and what are you doing next, basically. Um, so I figured today, for my own review and to help kind of realign and recenter my focus around what needs to happen next, and for anybody's context that ends up finding any of this beneficial, I figured I'd review a little bit of like why I'm here, like how I actually got here. So just a quick sort of reflection back. 4 years ago or so, I got out of the military, ended up moving to a new city. And so I wanted to get started in the tech industry. And that was really my whole idea. I had this sort of deep underlying interest in the idea of AI and how that sort of technology crosses and interlaces with humans and the understanding of how the mind in general works. So I knew that I was fascinated with those kinds of things. I'd had a general background prior to military in video game design and music. So those were kind of like my previous experience. But I was coming into this space with a sort of creative angle on these things, and I was just looking to get a job at a startup or something. So I literally got started when I first was here. I didn't have any connections, so I went and started working at a Home Depot. I was very gracious for that. They were pretty supportive of me as a veteran, to just pick up a job, even though I was clearly overqualified for the position of a store clerk at that point. But they hired me on, and I worked in there for like 3 or 4 weeks, and basically started to immediately go to a bunch of meetups, in-person sort of networking events and things that were around the Python programming language. And those turned out to be a huge boon, and just starting to get a bit of a network set up here. I didn't know anybody first, so going to those kinds of events, I mean, the whole point is to actually meet people and get to know a new community. So I met a guy there that became a really good friend of mine. He ended up, asking for anybody that was looking for jobs, because the startup he was working for at the time was looking for a few contractors to come and do like hardware work, like literally like soldering, printed computer board and components and that sort of thing. And I had a bunch of resumes on me, so I just like whipped one out of my backpack, and I was like, "Here you go. I am looking for work, sir." So like that ended up working out really well. I ended up working for that startup for about almost the entire first year that I was here. I got to Seattle here in the dead of winter during one of the rainiest years in recent history. There was a lot of ice, and just it was pretty gross. But basically, I worked there for a solid year. Got hired as a full-on engineer about 10 months into that job, and I'd been contracting that whole time. And then they ran out of a bunch of funding all of a sudden. They literally had just hired on 3 or 4 new people. And then a week later, they found out that they had lost like $1.5 million. So that was a bit of a misstep on the founders' perspective, and they were really open about that. They're like, we thought we had the money, and it turned out that wasn't the case. And this really sucks, but we've got to get rid of a bunch of people. And that was sort of the first learning experience that like, this is what happens at startups sometimes. Success is not guaranteed in any sense, and most of the time they tend to fail. This one did not. Ultimately, they're still going and doing really well now, but at the time they had to lay off, like 7 or 8 people all at once. And those of us that had just been hired got canned immediately. So that was a bit of a setback, but I ended up reflecting on that a lot over the months to come, and it turned out to be a really good thing. And the further into the future from that event that I've gotten, the better I've felt about the outcomes there. I took a few months off and ended up jumping into a software boot camp and made a go at that for a little while and did really well in that environment, and then started freelancing out of that school. I had no experience in it prior, but just kind of taking the perspectives I'd had from military and design before and all of that, it turned out in sort of the technology space, there's this whole realm of sort of like user-centered design, UX, interface building, front-end development. So I leaned really hard into that. And basically started finding lots of like pro bono gigs, working with or consulting with very small like seed teams of startups and that sort of thing, doing work for friends that I'd met through the meetup groups and whatnot. And that got me going. It got me some traction. It started to build up a bit of a reputation of like, hey, this is something that I can do. I can do web development, particularly front end. That was kind of my focus at the time. I started working with a nonprofit that was focused on VR, immersive technologies, and that was kind of a big leap forward as well, because that was always a domain of interest. I think if you come back to the idea that in the beginning, I came here really fascinated with just the general field of artificial intelligence and sort of human computer interface. And the sort of like cognition around all of that and the way that we interact and experience things. And then you take also like these backgrounds in like storytelling and world building in video games and sort of building sort of evocative or emotional experience around music in the past. All these things sort of lumped in together into this sort of medium of immersive tech or XR very early on. And I found that turned out to be a really cool medium to sort of mesh together all of these different perspectives and skills. So started leaning really hard into that. And we were building like a community platform, not a VR experience itself, but something for the VR community to give them a place to show off projects and ideas and research and things that they were doing. So worked on that for a while, picked up a few other jobs, some software design, development, things here and there. So I ended up basically spending a solid 2 years almost freelancing and doing contract work here and there, picking up projects every now and then. But at the end of that time, I hadn't quite figured out how to be sustainable from an income perspective. So I'd burned through most of the savings I had from that first company I worked for when I moved here. And it was becoming crunch time. It was getting, financials were getting pretty tight. Really needed to find something that was actually secure and stable for a while. So I started looking around for more of a long-term gig. During that time, when I was freelancing for those 2 years, I forgot to mention this. I started a podcast. It's almost like it's been almost 2 years ago now that we actually started it, but I met a co-creator on that. Kelly Campilia, she's awesome. She has her own sort of like film and like story production studio under the name of Fire Lady Films, and she was doing some exploration in VR and immersive tech as well. And so we decided to partner up and put together a podcast and basically have conversations with people around all these different topics that they were digging into, whether it was like experimenting with theater or VR being used in like medical applications or research around neuroscience, all kinds of things. Basically anybody that we could reach out to, whether they were a CEO or a random developer or, someone from theater that was just experimenting with the medium. That turned into a really cool gig for a while. It wasn't a paid thing. It was really a passion project. But that was something that we dove like headlong into for a solid 1.5 years, and then the pandemic hit. So when that happened, that kind of changed the game for everybody, obviously. But it really meant that it was going to be harder for me to find gigs because the world hadn't really adjusted to things yet. The projects that I had been working on prior to that had pretty much dried up, or I had pulled away from other ones that were left, that were still running. That I just wanted more time to focus on the podcast and on other things. And just this general theme of like trying to do more with my time around those interests around, this is experimental space where immersive tech enters into neuroscience, and AI is sort of affecting these domains as well. And this just general fascination around the human mind that I think ultimately it always sort of centered around this idea of humans and computers, and the way that they interface and interact. So the pandemic hit, kind of put a huge hiccup in things we were doing. We decided to put the podcast on hold, and I started looking for other work. Took like a solid 3 or 4 months, basically the whole summer, going into fall, to really start getting some traction, and did a bunch of interviewing, got some rejections here and there, and eventually got lucky, I feel. I had a reference from a friend I had talked to maybe 6 months prior to this. And this was in the fall of 2019. Yeah. So basically, reference came back like 6 months later. I had no expectation that job interest would have popped up, but they just happened to reach out. And so I worked for this company, doing a job I wasn't really sure about, like the focus area. It was in a new domain, kind of around like marketing and sales technologies. Interesting, but ultimately not really aligned with the sort of passions that I fundamentally had been trying to orbit more around over time. But I decided to give it a whirl. So I did that for like a solid year and a few months. And I think maybe 6 months, 9 months into that, I started to feel that I was kind of, going in a different direction away from this general interest area. So I started thinking about, like what would next steps be to get myself back on this track, back on this sort of domain, or like multidisciplinary domain, where sort of technology meets the brain, or technology meets humans, and the human experience. So started doing research, looked into schools. I found this field called cognitive science. And that seemed like the perfect sort of fit. It kind of combines, from an academic perspective, it's this whole field that tries to combine sort of, the whole efforts around AI and general artificial intelligence, and that endeavor to build something like a human mind, or as flexible as humans are. It takes into account, neuroscience and philosophy around how these things work or might work, and linguistics and learning. It takes in ethics around building these kinds of things. All of these different domains that have always been really fascinating, but I thus far in life never figured out a way to really center, my work around it, around those things. Other than doing these passion projects, the podcast felt like a really good step in that direction. So I started looking into university programs, and I was kind of laying out a plan. I'm going to go back to school eventually. I'm going to go back to school when I get to a good transition point from this job. I have GI Bill from the military, so I've got that resource. I should use it. I'm not getting any younger. And having that in mind, I think that's really when I started to figure out, I'm going to have to leave this job eventually. It's stable right now. It's reliable. We're in this crazy world-shaking situation where everything is locked down. Life has completely flipped on its head from the way that we knew before. And even coming out of the pandemic and kind of on this sort of slow transition to vaccines being more available now, still so much has changed since a year ago. remote work is a much more viable thing now, just because it's been a necessity for the last year. So everyone's had to evolve. So many companies have had to evolve in that regard. So the opportunities aren't as limited. So I started looking around. I started considering just my options. I talked to my leadership at the company there and gave them a heads up, before the holidays, 2020, and let them know, I'm planning to leave. And people always say that it's easier to find a job when you already have a job. Well, that's definitely true, in many regards, because you don't have to deal with the anxiety of not having work, not having a stable income, a paycheck that's coming in regularly. That it's really easy to forget when you do have that, how much general security and safety that gives you psychologically. And as soon as it's gone, even when you take it away yourself, it's not a surprise. I was sort of anticipating this for a couple months, going into the new year. But still, last Friday was my last day. And then today, Tuesday, the following week, and yesterday, as I was having this conversation with my friend online, the anxiety hit. The overwhelming sort of existential, oh God, what am I doing? I don't even, sure, I've been in theory planning out, these next steps and things that need to be done, laying out a pathway back to school and maybe some freelancing and sort of flexible work situations in the meantime as I get that straightened out. But as soon as I left that stable environment of having the paycheck and stable work and a team, and that general community of the company, it sort of hit me pretty hard yesterday. So today I've been doing a lot of reflection on all of that. And I had to sort of recenter. I had to remember that this is why I did this in the first place. Why I left that sort of cush situation, the stable work life balance, and decided to sort of strike out on my own again. It's kind of like a few years ago when I got let go from that startup for the first time, except this was on my own terms, but very different in so many other regards. So to recap, why am I here? The next steps for me, the next things I need to do now that I don't have a job, I have a little bit of runway. I'm anticipating probably about 6 months or so before I really need to take something else stable again. But that should be just enough time to figure out a few core things. What I had decided over the months prior to this, and had been anticipating over the last year or so, was that going back to school would involve looking for a program that focuses on cognitive sciences. As far as the specifics of what that would entail once I actually get there, that's not as important to me right now as the fact that the program is what I'm looking for. So there's specific schools like that. The other important thing coming out of this work situation is I've been living in the United States for most of my life. I spent time in the military and went overseas for a little bit doing that, but it's so different. In a multi-ditched effort, multifaceted endeavor to try to connect with family and cultural roots in other parts of the world, I sort of decided over that period of time that going back to school would also mean going overseas to school. I'm not focused on, having the most prestigious school that I go to. That's not as important at this point as trying to study and give myself time to focus on the things that are actually core to those passions, those fundamental interests that I'm in pursuit of now. And coming into the beginning of my 30s now, it's taken the last decade and some years just to start to home in on this, on an interest area. That's not to say that there is a clear idea of what that means from a work or profession perspective. That's something that I will have to figure out over the course of being in school again. But going back to school should enable a focus on that entirely, rather than trying to divide time between a full-time job, 70%, 75% of my energy going to a full-time work schedule, managing a bunch of clients and all of that general stress and energy. And instead, the goal over time is to try to focus more and more of that waking time, that executive focus on these things that matter more, that I feel like are where I can make a more valuable impact in the long term. But so getting back to school, and then specifically doing it overseas. So I'm looking at different places. I'm gonna look at programs in the UK. I've got a few in mind. There's some in Germany, there's some in the Netherlands, there's a few others here and there. But the next step right now is to take enough classes that I'm missing to finish out an AA degree, because I never did a bachelor's. I've been fine with it thus far, but it just feels like now I have the resource, and this is kind of a weird sort of direction where the path is not laid out. There are not positions where you could go and apply at a company and say, cognitive science, that's that's what I want to do. That's kind of stretching into domains that take a lot of different perspectives and bring them together, and you kind of have to chart your own path. At least that's been the observation of mine over the past couple of years now, poking around in VR and immersive tech and AI. AI is definitely a little more established at this point. If you're trying to find a job in AI, I mean, there's like, if you're interested in different kinds of machine learning, data science as a field, that's basically your starting point. But I think I could find a job in data science interesting, but I don't know that it would necessarily get to the root of those interests over the long haul. So it could be another stepping stone on the way. But applying to those, so starting to take classes again, that's the immediate thing. And then how do you support yourself without a consistent job like this? That's the question I'm trying to ask myself now. There's this concept of having a portfolio career, and it typically entails sort of having multiple different sort of skills that you can apply, that you can use in different domains. So that, I think I mentioned this last night, as industries change, as the demand for different kinds of work shifts over time, you can sort of adapt. A core aspect there is that you kind of have to like rotate through and focus on a certain skill set for uptime enough to get it to a good proficiency, one that's actually marketable. And then you can use a different one for a time, but it's different from just dabbling in a bunch of different things and not really being good enough at anything to actually sell that as a skill. So there are a few core things there that I can work off of. They themselves are not the core pursuit, perhaps. But for instance, a project that I'm working on right now, that I've been working on the side, it's with the same co-creator for the podcast, Kelly. We decided, like 9 months ago, to start brainstorming out a VR story. We'd had enough of doing a podcast. We wanted to actually create our own thing. So we started coming up with this idea of, how the hell would you create a sort of love story in VR, but with you as one of the characters in that pair. That's a hard problem to like put somebody in that situation and make them feel a spark for this other sort of artificial character. I mean, there's games that have tried to experiment with that. Journey, for instance, is a really good example. It uses real people as the other entities. You jump into there and you might run into somebody else, or you may not, you don't know. But the whole idea is focused around getting you to connect with other humans in this very sort of limited and abstract fashion. So we started trying to tackle that problem. But what I'm doing for that project is a combination of kind of being like a co-creator and designer of the experience overall, experienced designer per se, And I am entirely focused at this point now, 6 months later, where we've got a team of people working on this together. My whole focus now is the music and sound composition and design. It's like half the experience in VR. That is like half of the formula is the oral experience. So I've been working on composing for that and using like Ableton Live and synthesizers and instrumentation. I mean, I've got a freaking guitar in my back right now that I was playing around with before this. So that's like a whole side skill set. I haven't used it in as much in the professional sense, aside from like producing music with studios in a past life. But yeah, it's a new sort of foray. Does that turn into something that I can do as a freelancer? Who knows? Maybe, but I think this project needs to like get to a satisfying conclusion, or at least milestone of submission first before I can really start using those things for portfolio. But yeah, day 2 of like Monday, Tuesday now out of work. That's what I'm thinking about is, what skills right now do I have that I can lean on over the coming months as my priority. The whole reason I'm doing this is taking classes, filling in an AA degree where I'm missing the credits, and then using that to apply to these cognitive science programs. That's the real priority. I think I lost sight of that or got distracted from it in the overwhelming anxiety of it all last night when I was having this conversation. But after reflecting today, that's the conclusion. That's my sort of my center line, like North Star per se, is doing this to go back to school. So the point is not to figure out, how do I make myself a sustainable freelance business? The point is get back to school. So on the other fronts, it's just whatever I need to do. That may, in 6 months, be taking another full-time job. But the idea would be, if I do have to do that, 6 months' time, if I am not managing to sort of sustain from freelance work, a full-time job might look like some sort of like developer advocacy type work. I've had all this experience working directly with like on products in the tech space with, as an engineer, with engineers, with designers, as a product and project manager, a technical PM, a sort of solution architect type role, or like cloud support architect type role. We've done all these different things and done things like creating a podcast around technology. So they all sort of home in on this weird content creation and community outreach, and like product focused role. So that's something that, if I have to lean back on actually working for a company in the near future, that's probably what I would do. And I would specifically try to find a company that is more related to the AI realm, working somehow in artificial intelligence, or in the immersive tech space. I think if it's not focused in those domains that kind of cross over into cognitive science, it's not going in the right direction at this point. That's why I left this other job. That is why I left. So even if I start working for a company again in the near future on the way back to school, it's not a step backwards as long as I find something that is more in line with these interests in this long-term pursuit. So I feel pretty good about that. For the end of day 2 of thinking through this stuff, the finding work side of things is kind of the second priority. First thing, I have enough time right now to just get school going. Needs to happen. That's the priority. And then I'll start sorting out the work stuff. So yeah, that's where I'm at. I'm going to keep doing these. I think this is, if for no other reason, then, it might be beneficial for someone else to hear another person thinking through these kinds of thought processes in like pursuing a more fulfilling lifestyle, or leaving a corporate job to try to chase after some sort of like deep passion or interest. I hope that this can be helpful, and it's also really helpful for me. This is like a literal journal to reflect at the end of each day. So I'm going to keep doing these, and if anybody starts following along, maybe I'll see you around on the next one. But thanks for listening.